This is Singapore. For the past 50 years, this city-state has been one of the world's major economic success stories. Singapore has the fourth highest GDP per capita in the world. It's known for the high quality of its infrastructure, its efficient government, its reputation for having no corruption, and an economy that is seemingly almost always booming. But that success has come at a high price. Although it's considered a democracy, Singapore has a surprisingly repressive government for a country that elects its own leaders. In Singapore, public demonstrations are banned, so are vaping and chewing gum in public. Gathering in groups of 3 or more in public is illegal after 10 p.m. And if, like 3/4 of Singapore's population, you live in government-built housing, it's illegal for you to keep a cat. And forget about illicit drugs. You can get publicly caned or even sentenced to death for drug crimes. All of these repressive measures have been put in place by a government that is obsessed with economic and social success, one that is willing to go to great lengths to make sure society is doing everything and only the things that help Singapore succeed. But decades of these policies are now beginning to have negative consequences. Singapore today is facing a major demographic crisis and a housing crisis. With a land area of 730 square kilometers, the city-state has roughly half the land area of Sydney, Australia, but roughly the same number of people, 5.5 million. It has one of the world's lowest birth rates and needs immigration to keep its population from aging rapidly. But the constant influx of new residents is putting pressure on Singapore's scarcest resource, its land. House prices are running out of control, and many in Singapore wonder whether they will be able to maintain their high standard of living in the future. And decades of a hyper-competitive economy have left Singapore's population burned out, stressed out, and wondering if it's all been worth it. So how did Singapore get so rich? Why is its economic model beginning to fail? And what can Singapore do about it? In this video, we will answer these questions, but before we get started, make sure to hit the subscribe button to get notifications on our latest videos. And if you like this video, hit the like button. It helps us spread the word. Singapore's modern history began in 1819 when the British established a new colony at the south end of the Malay Peninsula. Its location between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean made it a perfect port for trade between China and India, which the British dominated at the time. Singapore began to grow and attracted migrants from across the oceans. Besides the local Malay population, the area was settled by Chinese and Indian migrants, and today those three groups are the core ethnicities of Singapore. The city stayed under British rule for more than a century, but when Britain failed to protect Singapore from a Japanese invasion in World War II, many in the city turned against British rule, and an independence movement was born. In the years after World War II, Singapore negotiated its exit from the British Empire and negotiated its way into the newly independent country of Malaysia. But Singapore's time in Malaysia would be short. Tensions broke out between the Malay population and Singapore's ethnic Chinese, with the Chinese objecting to many of Malaysia's rules that gave special treatment to Malay people and placed quotas on non-Malay citizens. Within a few years, the alliance fell apart, and in 1965, Malaysia voted to evict Singapore from the country. From that point on, Singapore would be an independent city-state. One person above all others defined Singapore in those early years of its independence: Lee Kuan Yew. He was Singapore's first prime minister and dominated the country's politics until he stepped down in 1990. Yew set out the philosophy that would guide Singapore's development. He famously declared that Singapore had only two resources: its people and hard work. So Lee Kuan Yew got the people of Singapore working. He set up an incredibly competitive education system, one that involves a system called streaming. Children's test scores determine which high schools they are streamed into. Which high schools they attend determines which universities they have access to, and which universities they attend determine their opportunities in life. In Singapore, children learned early that their performance in school would shape their entire lives. For instance, to get a job in the public service, you have to present your school test results going all the way back to age 16. Making the population more productive was an overt goal for the Singaporean government in a way that wasn't for other countries. In 1982, the government launched a new TV ad campaign featuring Timmy, the productivity bee. While American school children were learning about the dangers of forest fires from Smokey the Bear, Singaporean children were being taught that the harder they work, the better off all of Singapore will be. For a long time, this focus on productivity was a huge success. By the 1970s, Singapore was busily developing one of the most advanced economies in Asia. At that time, it had become a major hub for oil refining, but Lee Kuan Yew wanted to expand that to more advanced manufacturing. Lee set up an economic development board that focused on building Singapore into a manufacturing powerhouse. Singapore's leaders understood that the city-state needed foreign investment, and it made Singapore into one of the most investor-friendly places in the world. Singapore attracted foreign businesses by promising a place for them where they could operate without unions unions, and tax-free for the first 10 years. Pretty soon the city was the regional Asian headquarters for countless businesses around the world. Now Singapore had an educated workforce, foreign investment, and a strong work ethic, but it still needed one more thing: more people to grow its economy. Beginning in the 1980s, Singapore launched a liberal immigration policy that attracted both high-skilled workers from wealthy countries in Europe and North America, which increased the country's human capital, as well as low-skilled labor from poor countries, which gave the country the workforce it needed to be a manufacturing powerhouse. That contributed to a major population boom. Singapore's population basically tripled between independence in 1965 and today. Yet today, this magic formula for success is beginning to break down. For one thing, Singapore's population has developed a serious case of Kiasu. That's a Chinese term for fear of losing, and it has become a major part of Singapore's culture. People work hard not to achieve their individual goals, but to avoid falling behind in a society that constantly pushes people to work more and more. Many lay the blame for Kiasu with Singapore's competitive schooling system. The constant pressure to succeed academically has created a society of people who are paranoid about falling behind, but at the same time, creativity and innovation have been drained right out of them. The number of studies have shown where Kiasu is high, levels of individual creativity are low. One study found that when people focused on Singapore's competitive culture, they had lower creativity than people who focused on Singapore's multicultural and multi-ethnic society. In other words, thinking about Singapore's diverse and energetic society made people more inspired, but thinking about the country's education system, its high house prices, and its limited opportunities caused creativity to plummet. Kiasu isn't unique to Singapore. It's seen in many Asian cultures, but few places are suffering as intensely from its impact. Singapore's mentality as a small country that needs to work hard to survive has had a major payoff economically, but it has come at a price: a conformist society that can never lead in innovation, only follow. Can you think of any major Singaporean brands? Probably not, and you probably never will. The culture of creativity and innovation that has powered the global economy in recent decades has passed Singapore right by. This may be simply the price of living in a society where you can't even chew gum outdoors. And today, Singapore is facing a housing crisis that threatens to undo decades of economic growth. Ironically, the very same system the country set up to address a housing crisis after World War II is now part of a new housing crisis. Following World War II, Singapore suffered from a major shortage of homes for what was then a population of 1.5 million people. So the government set up the Housing and Development Board, or HDB. The HDB's job was to create massive amounts of social housing on a small plot of land. It achieved this by building up. High-rise apartment buildings began to pop up all over the city-state. The plan worked. Within 5 years, the HDB had built 54,000 housing units, and within a decade of its formation, it had fixed Singapore's housing shortage. Today, 3/4 of Singapore's population lives in HDB-built housing. HDB housing isn't social housing the way you might think of it in the US or UK. It isn't a government-owned apartment that you rent for cheap. HDB apartments are sold to their occupants on a 99-year lease. In this way, Singapore has achieved one of the highest home ownership rates in the world at around 80%. These social housing leases can be bought and sold on an unregulated secondary market. As Singapore's population has grown and grown, that secondary market has exploded, and with it, the prices people are paying for housing. HDB houses may be price controlled when they're first built, but they end up in a market where the law of supply and demand dictates prices. And today, prices are very high. Like in many places, house prices soared during the COVID-19 pandemic and have stayed high. Many government-built apartments are now selling for more than $1 million. This is causing Singaporeans to worry. They wonder if future generations will have the same opportunity to buy an affordable home as the last few generations did. The old social contract was work hard, help Singapore, the tiny city-state, to survive, and you will be rewarded with a high standard of living. But now this social contract is falling apart, and as the cost of living rises and the land available for new homes disappears, it's creating new tensions between locals and Singapore's migrant community. The community is huge. Of the 5.5 million people in Singapore, only about 3.5 million are citizens. The rest, nearly a third of the population, are either permanent or temporary residents, most of them temporary. In recent years, rare and risky protests have broken out against further immigration, but the government is insistent that Singapore needs migrants, and the statistics show why. With an average of just 1.1 children per woman, Singapore has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Without immigration, the country's population would have started to shrink many years ago. The shrinking population of working-age people would have a harder and harder time paying to support the large and growing retired population. This isn't unique to Singapore. For instance, check out our recent video on the protests in France against against the country's plans to raise the retirement age. That controversial plan is also the result of a low birth rate, not enough people to support an aging population. But during the COVID pandemic, with Singapore having some of the tightest restrictions of any country, its population began to shrink as expats and foreign workers left. Now, the government is stepping up efforts to woo people back to Singapore, including a new 5-year visa for high-income earners, as well as reforms to improve conditions for low-wage laborers. Many of Singapore's 300,000 migrant workers live in poor conditions, work long hours, and are subject to all sorts of abuse, such as having their passports confiscated. Among its reforms, the government recently increased the maximum amount of healthcare coverage for foreign workers from 15,000 Singapore dollars to 60,000. Still, many of Singapore's biggest problems, the housing crisis, the Kiasu mental health crisis, the lack of an innovation economy, remain unsolved. And the government is taking some steps to move away from that system. For instance, it is announced that starting in 2024, Singapore will be moving away from its practice of streaming students into different schools at an early age. The exam schedule is being lightened a little, and schools have started teaching mental resilience to students. But for the most part, little has changed, and many wonder whether that has to do with Singapore's political system, which once upon a time was hailed for its stability, but today it looks more like it's stagnating. For its entire history since independence, Singapore has been ruled by Lee Kuan Yew's party, the People's Action Party. The PAP won every single parliamentary seat in every election between 1965 and 1980, and today, even though it's not the only party in parliament, it still holds an iron grip on the country. It hasn't done that just by being very good at winning elections. It has maintained its dominance through authoritarian measures such as controlling the news media and passing oppressive laws. Openly criticizing the government can get you a public caning. The country consistently ranks low on measures of press and political freedoms. With a regime like that, it's no wonder that many of Singapore's neighbors see the city-state as a place of total conformity and obedience, a place where people are robotic and lacking in personality. Taking on such a stance might be the only way to survive such strict authoritarianism. But today, with problems piling up in Singapore's economy, its long-standing political leadership may want to consider a new approach. If Singapore wants to be an innovator in the 21st century, it might have to loosen up a little and allow people to speak their minds more freely. It may want to consider taking the foot off the pedal of an intensely competitive and conformist education system and let people learn better how to think and create for themselves. What worked yesterday isn't necessarily what will work tomorrow, and for Singapore, it might just be time for a change. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.